At my dad's retirement party, my parents told me, "You're signing your bonus over to your brother, he needs it more." I looked at them and said, "That money isn't yours to give away," then handed Dad one envelope. My dad had just finished his retirement speech when my mom walked over to me with a piece of paper folded in half and told me I needed to sign it before the cake was cut. I honestly thought she was joking. There were about 30 people in the room, mostly relatives, a few of Dad's former co-workers, 2 neighbors, and several people I had only met that afternoon. There were balloons tied to the backs of folding chairs, a sheet cake with my dad's name written across it, and a framed photo of him from his first year at the company sitting on the gift table. My dad had worked there for 32 years. He started right out of high school, moved through several departments, and eventually became a supervisor. He was the kind of person who kept the same coffee mug for 20 years because he saw no reason to replace something that still worked. Retirement was a huge deal for him. He had been talking about it for months. He had even started counting down the weeks on a little calendar in the kitchen. So when my mom approached me during the party with a folded piece of paper, I assumed it was something sentimental. Maybe a note from her. Maybe something she wanted me to write in Dad's retirement scrapbook. Instead, she told me the paper was an agreement transferring my entire retirement bonus to my younger brother, Eric. I stared at her for a few seconds because my brain genuinely refused to process what she was saying. The bonus was mine. It had nothing to do with Dad's retirement. It had nothing to do with Eric. It was a performance bonus from my employer that I had earned after spending most of the previous year working ridiculous hours on a project that had nearly burned me out. I had already received the notification from payroll that it would be deposited the following week. It was a little over $18,000 after taxes. That wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to make a huge difference for me. I had planned to use most of it to pay down my car loan and finish replacing the old roof on my house. My mom knew all of that. That's why I thought I had misunderstood her. I asked her what she meant. She explained that Eric needed the money more than I did, and that the family had already decided it made sense. I looked past her toward my brother. He was standing near the food table with a paper plate in one hand and his phone in the other. He was 31 years old. He had a full-time job. He had recently moved into a nicer apartment. And as far as I knew, he had been complaining about money because he had taken on a car payment he couldn't comfortably afford. That didn't make my bonus his. I told Mom I wasn't signing anything. She immediately became irritated. She said I was making a simple family matter into something ugly. I remember looking at that piece of paper again and wondering when they had decided that my money was something they could distribute among themselves. I asked why nobody had discussed this with me before the party. Mom said they didn't want me to have time to overthink it. That sentence bothered me more than almost anything else. I asked whether Dad knew. She hesitated. Then she said Dad knew that Eric was struggling and that I was in a position to help. That wasn't the same thing as Dad knowing she had prepared a document transferring my bonus. I looked over at my father. He was standing beside the retirement cake, smiling while one of his old co-workers told him a story. He looked genuinely happy. I didn't want to ruin his retirement party. That was the first reason I almost let it go. The second reason was that I was embarrassed. I didn't want 30 people watching my family fight about money. The third reason was that this wasn't the first time Eric had received preferential treatment. It was just the first time someone had put it on paper. When we were kids, Eric was always the one who needed something. If I got a used car, Eric needed help with a newer one. If I worked a summer job, Mom reminded me that Eric needed spending money. If I saved for something, I was praised for being responsible and then asked whether I could help him. I had spent years telling myself that this was simply how families worked. I was the responsible son. Eric was the one everyone worried about. I had eventually stopped expecting things to be equal. But I had never expected my parents to tell me that my employer's money belonged to my brother. I folded the paper and handed it back to Mom. I told her I wasn't signing it. She looked at me like I had just insulted her. She reminded me that this was Dad's retirement day. I told her that was exactly why I didn't want to argue about it there. She said I was being selfish. I didn't answer. I walked away and went to get myself a glass of water. About 5 minutes later, my brother came over. He didn't ask about the paper. He asked whether I had signed it. I said no. He looked disappointed rather than surprised. That was the moment I realized he already knew. I asked him how long he had known. He shrugged and said Mom had told him a few days earlier that she was working something out. I asked whether he knew the amount. He said he knew it was enough to get him out of a hole. I asked what hole. He didn't answer directly. He just said that I had plenty of money and he didn't. That irritated me because he had no idea what my finances actually looked like. I had a mortgage. I had a car loan. I had home repairs. I had health insurance premiums and property taxes and utility bills. I wasn't sitting on piles of cash. I had simply learned to save because nobody was coming to rescue me if something went wrong. Eric had learned the opposite lesson. If something went wrong, somebody rescued him. I didn't understand how deep that pattern went until much later. At the time, I thought this was just one more argument about money. I didn't realize the bonus was only the surface of the problem. I went back to my dad's retirement party and tried to act normal. That became surprisingly difficult. Every few minutes, someone would congratulate Dad. People talked about his years at the company. His former supervisor gave him a framed certificate. My aunt brought up old stories about Dad working overtime when we were kids. My dad laughed more that afternoon than I had seen him laugh in months, and I kept thinking about the envelope in my mom's purse. Eventually, Dad called me over. He put his hand on my shoulder and thanked me for coming. He told me he was proud of me. I almost told him everything. Instead, I said I was happy for him. That night, after the party ended, I drove home and sat in my driveway for almost 10 minutes before going inside. I kept replaying the conversation with Mom. The part that bothered me most was her saying they didn't want me to overthink it. That meant they had expected me to object. They had planned around my objection, and if they had planned around my objection, then the paper probably wasn't the whole story. The next morning, I checked my email. There was nothing from my employer about changing the bonus. I checked my bank account. Nothing unusual. I checked my payroll portal. The bonus was still listed under my name. Then I remembered something Mom had said months earlier. She had asked me whether my bonus would be paid before Christmas. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Now I wasn't so sure. I called my bank because I wanted to make sure nobody had attempted to access my account. They told me there had been no unauthorized activity. That made me feel better for about 10 minutes. Then I started thinking about the agreement. It couldn't actually transfer money that hadn't been deposited yet unless I agreed to it. But why would she have bothered preparing it? I took a picture of the paper before returning it to her. I wasn't trying to build a case against my mother. I just wanted a record of what had happened. That decision turned out to matter. 2 days later, Mom called me. She was calmer this time. She said the family had discussed the situation and she wanted me to reconsider. I asked which family members had discussed it. She said Dad, her, and Eric. I asked whether Dad had actually seen the document. She said yes. That bothered me. I asked what he thought. She said he thought I should help my brother. I told her I had no problem helping Eric if I chose to. I did have a problem with being told I had to give him my money. Mom said family wasn't supposed to keep score. I reminded her that nobody had asked Eric to give me money when I needed help. She said that was different. I asked how. She didn't have an answer. Instead, she started talking about everything my parents had done for me growing up. Food, school supplies, college expenses, car insurance, family vacations, all the normal things parents do for their children. I listened. Then I told her I appreciated what they had done for me. I also told her that didn't mean they own my paycheck forever. She became angry and ended the call. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, my employer sent me the final bonus confirmation. The amount was $18,742 before taxes. I had already calculated what I planned to do with it. I was going to pay off the remaining balance on my car loan, put several $1,000s toward my roof, and keep the rest as an emergency fund. I printed the confirmation. I also printed my mortgage statement, my car loan statement, and a few other bills. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I was starting to realize that my parents had created a story about me having plenty of money without actually knowing anything about my finances. I wanted to know whether I had somehow misunderstood my own situation. I hadn't. I was doing fine. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't struggling. I was simply responsible, and apparently in my family, being responsible had become an invitation to be assigned other people's problems. The following weekend, I went to my parents' house for dinner. Eric was there. My parents had made pasta, and the whole evening felt strangely normal at first. Then Mom brought up the bonus. She said she didn't understand why I was still making such a big deal about it. I told her because it was still my money. Eric got defensive. He said he wasn't asking for a handout. I reminded him that he was literally asking me to sign over an $18,742 bonus. He said he hadn't written the agreement. I told him I knew. Then Dad finally spoke. He said he thought I should consider helping Eric because Eric was in a difficult situation. I asked what difficult situation. Dad said Eric had debts. I asked what kind. Eric interrupted and said it wasn't my business. That was fair. His debts were not my business. But if everyone was demanding my money because of those debts, I thought I had a right to understand what I was being asked to fix. Eric said he had gotten behind on some bills. Mom said he had also fallen behind on his car payment. Dad said they were worried he might lose his apartment. That surprised me. Eric's apartment was nicer than mine. He had moved there less than a year earlier. I asked how much he owed. Nobody answered. I didn't push. Instead, I said I wasn't giving him the bonus. Dad looked disappointed. Mom looked angry. Eric looked embarrassed. That was the first moment when I felt genuinely bad for him. I didn't want him humiliated. I told him I wasn't refusing because I hated him. I just didn't agree with the solution. He said I had no idea what it was like to be under financial pressure. I almost laughed. Then I remembered how many times I had been under financial pressure without telling anyone. I stopped myself. I told him if he wanted help making a budget, I would help. He didn't respond. The dinner ended early. On the drive home, I wondered whether I had been too harsh. I kept thinking about Dad. He had just retired. Maybe he was scared about money. Maybe my parents genuinely thought helping Eric would stabilize the family. I wanted to believe that. Then, 2 days later, I received an email from my employer's payroll department. They said someone had contacted the company asking about the procedure for redirecting my bonus. The person had not been authorized. Payroll had not released any information, but the contact had been logged. I immediately called them. They couldn't tell me everything because of privacy rules. They did tell me that the person had identified themselves as a family member and had asked whether an employee could assign a bonus to another individual. I asked whether they had given the person any information about me. They said no. I thanked them. Then I sat at my desk staring at my monitor. I knew who had called. I just didn't know which family member. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't even tell my parents about the email. Instead, I started keeping records. I saved every message. I photographed every document. I wrote down dates and times of conversations. I downloaded my payroll statements. I made sure my bank accounts had updated passwords and two-factor authentication. It felt excessive. I actually felt ridiculous doing it. This was my family. I wasn't investigating strangers, but something had changed. I no longer trusted that everyone involved was telling me the whole truth. A few days later, Eric texted me. He apologized for the way things had gone at dinner. He said he didn't want to fight with me. He also said Mom had told him I had already agreed to help and was now changing my mind. I stared at that message for a long time. I had never agreed, not once. I asked him when Mom had told him that. He said she had mentioned it weeks earlier. That was the first truly frightening part. Weeks earlier, I had not even known about the bonus. I called Eric. He didn't answer. Later that evening, he texted me that he was busy. I decided not to push. The next morning, I checked my credit report. There was nothing unusual. I checked my mortgage account. Everything was normal. I checked my retirement account. Nothing had changed. Then I noticed an old email from my mother that I had ignored months earlier. She had asked me for a copy of a document from my employer. At the time, I thought she wanted proof of my employment for some family paperwork. Now I wondered why. I searched my email for other messages from her containing words like bonus, payroll, employer benefits, insurance, and retirement. There were more than I remembered. None of them were proof of anything. But together, they made me uncomfortable. I called my mom and asked why she had been asking about my employment benefits. She became defensive. She said she was my mother and was allowed to be curious about my life. I told her curiosity was one thing. Calling my employer was another. There was a long pause. Then she denied calling them. I asked whether she had asked anyone else to call. She said no. I didn't argue. I just thanked her and ended the call. That evening, I called my dad. I asked him directly whether he had called my employer. He sounded surprised. He said no. I asked whether he knew who had. He said he didn't. Then he admitted that Mom had been handling the bonus issue. I asked what he thought she was doing. He said she had told him that I had agreed to help Eric. I asked when I had agreed. He said he couldn't remember exactly. That answer bothered me. Dad wasn't a dishonest person. He was conflict avoidant. There was a difference. I think he had heard something from Mom, assumed it was true, and didn't want to challenge it because challenging her would create a fight. That didn't make him innocent, but it helped me understand him. He wasn't plotting against me. He was avoiding a problem until the problem became mine. A few days later, I received a certified letter. It was from a law office. For a second, I thought it might be related to my mortgage. It wasn't. The letter stated that there was a disagreement involving a financial commitment that my family believed I had made. It didn't say I owed Eric the bonus. It asked me to preserve relevant documents and contact the office if I disputed the claim. I sat at my kitchen table reading it twice. My first reaction was anger. My second was fear. My third was embarrassment. I wondered what story my parents had told someone. I called the law office. The attorney who handled the matter wasn't accusing me of anything. They explained that Eric had apparently received advice about his debts and had represented that family assistance was expected. The attorney said there was no signed agreement from me. That was the important part. But someone had apparently provided a draft document that looked like an agreement. I asked who had prepared it. The attorney couldn't discuss another person's confidential communications. I understood. I ended the call and sat there for a while. Then I looked at the photograph I had taken of the paper Mom had given me. It wasn't the same document. The one she had shown me at the retirement party was a simple family agreement. The document referenced by the attorney had different wording. It mentioned my expected bonus as though it were already committed. That meant there was another document. I didn't know where it came from. I called Mom. She refused to talk about it. Dad called me later. He sounded exhausted. He said he thought the situation had gotten out of hand. I told him I agreed. I asked him to send me copies of anything he had signed or received. He said he would look. The next afternoon, he emailed me 3 attachments. 2 were ordinary. The third was a scanned document. It was a draft financial agreement. My name was typed at the top. My social security number was not included. There was no signature. But the document claimed that I had agreed to transfer my upcoming bonus to help settle Eric's outstanding debts. I read it 3 times. Then I noticed the date. It was from nearly a month before my retirement party. I hadn't known the exact amount of my bonus then. Neither had my parents, or at least I thought they hadn't. I called payroll again. They explained that the bonus amount had been projected internally before final approval. I asked whether anyone outside the company could have known the projected amount. They said not through any authorized channel. That was when the whole thing started to make sense. My mother had been planning around money that hadn't even been finalized. She had already told Eric he was getting it. She had already created paperwork. She had apparently contacted my employer. And Dad had believed I had agreed because Mom had told him I had. The missing piece was still how she had gotten the number. Then I remembered something. Months earlier, during a family dinner, Mom had asked to see my work email because she wanted to send me a photo from an old family reunion. I had handed her my phone while it was unlocked. She had scrolled through my photos, at least that's what I thought. I had completely forgotten about it. I checked my account security. There had been a login from a device I didn't recognize several months earlier. The date matched that dinner. I didn't know whether the 2 things were connected. I wasn't going to accuse her without proof. But I changed every password again. I also enabled additional security on my email. Then I did something I had never done before. I called a lawyer, not because I wanted to sue my parents. I wanted to understand what my rights were. The attorney listened to everything. I showed them the documents. I showed them the messages. I showed them the payroll email. I showed them the draft agreement and the photograph from the retirement party. The attorney told me something simple. I didn't have to sign anything. I wasn't responsible for my brother's debts, and I needed to stop trying to resolve a legal and financial issue through family arguments. That last part was the hardest. I wanted my parents to understand. I wanted them to admit what they had done. The attorney told me I might never get that. Instead, I needed to protect myself, so I did. I opened a separate account at a different bank. I redirected my payroll deposit. I reviewed my credit report again. I froze my credit. I contacted the relevant institutions and asked what documents would be required for anyone to act on my behalf. I created a folder with every piece of evidence. I also wrote down a timeline while everything was still fresh. The retirement party, the paper, the conversations, the payroll contact, the texts, the letter from the attorney, the document Dad sent me. I didn't embellish anything. I didn't guess. If I didn't know something, I wrote that I didn't know. That turned out to be important later. A week after I spoke to the lawyer, my parents invited me over. I almost didn't go. I decided I would go only if the conversation stayed calm. Dad met me at the door. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table. Eric wasn't there. That immediately made me suspicious. Mom said she wanted to explain everything. I told her I was willing to listen. She explained that Eric had accumulated more debt than she had realized. Some of it came from credit cards. Some came from medical bills. Some came from a personal loan. There were also late rent payments. She said she had panicked. She had been afraid Eric would lose his apartment. She said Dad's retirement meant their own income was about to change, and she didn't think they could keep helping him. Then she told me she had believed my bonus was the obvious solution. I asked why she had told Eric he was getting it before asking me. She said she thought I would help if I understood how serious things were. I reminded her that she hadn't explained anything to me. She admitted that. I asked why she had created the agreement. She said it was to make sure I wouldn't change my mind. That sentence made me realize she still didn't understand what she had done wrong. She thought the problem was that I had resisted. She didn't see the problem as the decision itself. I asked Dad whether he had known about the document. He said he had seen a version. I asked whether he knew Mom had contacted my employer. He said no. I asked whether he knew she had told Eric the money was his. He said he thought she had discussed it with him. Mom interrupted and said she had only been trying to keep the family together. I told her that taking money from one family member to cover another family member's debts wasn't keeping the family together. It was transferring the problem. She started crying. That made me feel horrible. I hated seeing my mother cry. For a moment, I wanted to apologize just to make the situation stop. Then I remembered the document with my name on it. I remembered the phone call to payroll. I remembered being told I didn't get time to overthink it. I stayed quiet. Mom eventually admitted that she had accessed my email. She said she had only looked at information related to my bonus. I asked whether she had given anything to anyone. She said she had shown Eric some of the information. Then Dad looked at her. I think that was the moment he realized how much she had actually done. He asked her whether she had contacted my employer. She finally admitted she had. She said she had only asked general questions. I told her that payroll had documented the contact. She said she didn't realize it was a serious matter. I believed her. That was the strangest part. I didn't think my mother had set out to commit some elaborate crime. I thought she had convinced herself that what she was doing was justified. She believed I had more than enough. She believed Eric deserved another chance. She believed parents were supposed to solve problems. And because she believed those things, she had gradually crossed boundaries that she probably would have condemned if someone else had done them. I told her I wasn't going to sign anything. I also told her I wouldn't discuss my finances with her anymore. She looked devastated. Dad looked tired. I left. For several weeks, nothing happened. Then Eric's landlord sent him a notice. He really was behind on rent. That was when I understood why everyone had been so desperate. Eric had not just made a few bad purchases. He had been living beyond what he could afford for a long time. His car payment was huge. He had several credit cards. He had borrowed money from my parents. He had also apparently borrowed money from other relatives. I learned that last part accidentally when my aunt called me. She wasn't asking me for money. She was asking whether Eric had told me about the family loan. I asked what she meant. She said she had loaned Eric several $1,000s the previous year. I didn't know that. Then another relative told me they had helped him with his car. It became clear that Eric had been receiving small rescues from different people for years. Nobody had seen the entire picture. Everyone had only seen the piece he showed them. My parents had been trying to cover the gap. Eventually, the gap became too large, and my bonus became their solution. Eric called me one evening. He apologized. He said he understood why I was angry. He told me he had never asked Mom to access my email. He also said he had assumed I had agreed because she kept telling him that I had. I asked him why he hadn't asked me directly. He admitted he was embarrassed. I understood that. If he had called me and honestly said he was drowning financially, I probably would have helped him in some way. Maybe not with $18,742, but I would have helped. Instead, everyone had gone around me. That changed how I felt about him. I still loved my brother, I just didn't trust him. We talked for almost an hour. He told me he was going to sell the car. He had found a cheaper apartment. He was working overtime. He was going to negotiate payment plans with his creditors. I told him I thought those were good steps. I also told him I wasn't giving him the bonus. He said he understood. That was the first peaceful conversation we'd had in months. The bonus finally arrived. After taxes, it was significantly less than the original figure. That alone made the whole situation almost absurd. My mother had been fighting over $18,742 before taxes. The amount I actually received was much smaller. I paid off my car. I put money aside for the roof. I kept an emergency fund. I didn't tell anyone the exact balances. For the first time in years, I realized how strange it was that my family knew so much about my finances. I had always treated family as automatically trustworthy. I had confused closeness with access. Those are not the same thing. My dad eventually asked me to come over. He had something for me. It was a plain white envelope. He told me he had been thinking about the retirement party. He said he hated that my money had become part of his retirement celebration. He said that wasn't how he wanted to remember the day. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. It wasn't an apology exactly. Dad was not good at apologies. Instead, he wrote that he was proud of the man I had become and that he had made a mistake by assuming I would always absorb the family's problems because I was capable of doing so. That note meant more to me than he probably realized. I asked him whether he wanted me to forgive Mom. He said he wasn't asking for that. He said he just wanted me to have whatever relationship with them felt healthy. That was probably the wisest thing he had ever said about the situation. My relationship with my mother changed. For a while, we barely spoke. She would send short messages about birthdays or holidays. I would respond politely. We didn't discuss money. We didn't discuss my job. We didn't discuss my accounts. Eventually, she started therapy. She told me she was trying to understand why she had always felt responsible for fixing Eric's problems. I didn't know whether it would last. I hoped it would. I also didn't make it my responsibility. That was another lesson I had to learn. My brother's situation improved slowly. He sold his expensive car. He moved into a smaller apartment. He started using a written budget. He paid off one credit card and negotiated lower payments on another. He also stopped asking our parents for money. That changed the family dynamic more than anything else. My parents had been so used to rescuing him that when he stopped needing immediate rescue, they didn't know what to do with themselves. They started taking walks together. Dad worked on projects around the house. Mom started volunteering a few mornings a week. The family became quieter, not necessarily happier immediately, just quieter. There was less crisis, less frantic phone calling, less discussion about who owed whom. At Thanksgiving that year, we all sat around the same table. Nobody mentioned the bonus. Nobody mentioned the retirement party. Nobody mentioned the document. I expected the silence to feel awkward. It didn't. My brother brought a pie. Mom made too much food, as usual. Dad complained that the turkey was too dry. It was probably the most normal family dinner we'd had in years. After dinner, Dad and I washed dishes. He told me he had kept the envelope I gave him at his retirement party. I had forgotten about it. He said he opened it later that night. It contained something completely different from what Mom had expected. It was a copy of a letter I had written to him about retirement. I had written down some of the things I remembered from growing up. My first bike, the time he taught me to change a tire, the first day he took me to his workplace because my school was closed, the way he always came to my school events even when he had worked late. I had also included a cashier's check for $1,000, not because he needed it, because I wanted him to have some money for something fun. That was the envelope I had been planning to give him all along. I had kept it in my car because I didn't want him opening it during the party. When Mom confronted me about the bonus, I had forgotten about it completely. Dad said the envelope meant more to him than any amount of money. I told him I was glad. Then he asked me something that surprised me. He asked whether I regretted not giving Eric the bonus. I thought about it. I said no. I told him I regretted that the situation had gotten so ugly. I regretted not recognizing the problem earlier. I regretted that I had sometimes treated Eric's problems as annoyances instead of realizing he was genuinely struggling. But I didn't regret saying no. Dad nodded. He said he didn't either. That was the closest thing to closure I got. There wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene. Nobody got arrested. Nobody became rich. There was no revenge. My mother didn't suddenly transform into a perfect person. My brother didn't become financially responsible overnight. My father didn't become confrontational. What happened was much less satisfying in the movie sense and much more satisfying in real life. The facts became impossible to ignore. The document showed I hadn't agreed. The payroll records showed the contact with my employer. The messages showed that my brother had been told about the money before I had ever agreed to anything. The emails showed my mother had been looking into my bonus. The bank records showed my own finances were nowhere near as comfortable as my family had assumed. Once everything was written down, nobody could keep arguing about what had happened. They could argue about why it happened. They could argue about whether anyone meant harm. They could argue about whether I should forgive them, but they couldn't change the facts. That was what made the whole thing different for me. Before this happened, I thought keeping records was something businesses did. I thought family didn't need documentation. I thought trust meant you didn't need to prove anything. Now I understand that documentation isn't always about distrust. Sometimes it's simply a way of protecting everyone's memory from turning into competing versions of the truth. I also learned that being the responsible person in a family can become its own trap. People start assuming you can handle things. Then they assume you should handle things. Then eventually they stop asking. They just expect. For years, I had rewarded that expectation by saying yes whenever the problem wasn't too big. I thought I was being generous. Sometimes I was just avoiding conflict. That distinction took me a long time to understand. I still help my family. I just don't do it automatically. If someone asks for money, I decide whether I can afford to give it. If I can't, I say no. If I want to help in another way, I offer that. If someone tries to make me feel guilty, I don't argue. I just repeat the decision. My relationship with Eric is actually better now than it was before the retirement party. We don't pretend the situation never happened. We also don't talk about it constantly. He has told me more than once that being forced to confront his finances was probably the best thing that happened to him, even though he hated it at the time. He eventually paid off most of his high-interest debt. He still has some. He still makes mistakes, but now he deals with them himself. My mother and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. There are still boundaries. There are probably always going to be. She doesn't have access to my accounts. She doesn't have my work information. She doesn't know exactly what I earn. She knows that if I ever want her to know, I'll tell her. That boundary used to feel cruel to me. Now it feels normal. My dad's retirement has also gone better than I expected. He spends a lot of time in the garage. He takes long walks. He watches more baseball than any person reasonably needs to watch. He complains about being bored, then turns down every suggestion that involves a schedule. He jokes that retirement is mostly moving slowly from one chair to another. I think he's happy. The retirement party itself is still a strange memory. When I think about it now, I don't remember the cake first. I don't remember the balloons. I don't remember the speech. I remember my mother's hand holding that folded paper. I remember realizing that everyone else seemed to know what was happening except me. I remember looking across the room at my brother and seeing the disappointment on his face. I remember wondering whether I was being selfish. And I remember the envelope sitting in my car. That envelope was the part I didn't understand at the time. I had gone to my dad's retirement party intending to celebrate him. I had planned a small gift. I had written him a personal letter. I wanted to give him something that showed him I appreciated everything he had done for me. Then, for a few minutes, my family turned the whole thing into an argument about what I owed my brother. I almost let that change the meaning of the day. I almost signed something because I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I almost gave away money I had worked for because I was afraid of looking selfish. Instead, I said no, not loudly, not dramatically, just no, and then I gave my dad the envelope I had brought for him. I don't think that was some brilliant act of revenge. It wasn't. It was actually the simplest decision I made during the entire mess. I was there for my dad. The money in that envelope was mine to give. The bonus was mine to keep. Those two things could both be true. I could love my family without surrendering control of my finances. I could care about my brother without becoming responsible for his debts. I could understand why my mother panicked without pretending what she did was acceptable. And I could forgive my father for avoiding the conflict without allowing him to decide my boundaries for me. The biggest thing I took from all of it wasn't that I had won. I don't really think I won. I think I finally stopped participating in a system where saying no made me the bad guy. Once I stopped doing that, everyone had to deal with their own choices. My brother had to deal with his debt. My mother had to deal with why she had tried to control my money. My father had to deal with the fact that avoiding conflict had allowed someone else's decision to become my problem, and I had to deal with my own part in it. I had spent years making myself easy to rely on. I had taught everyone around me that I would absorb inconvenience quietly. I couldn't blame them entirely for believing what I had shown them, so I changed what I showed them. I started saying no when I meant no. I stopped explaining every decision. I stopped sharing financial information just because someone asked. I stopped believing that guilt was evidence that I had done something wrong, and surprisingly, the family didn't fall apart. It adjusted. Some relationships became more distant. Some became stronger. Some became more honest. That's probably the closest thing I have to a happy ending. Nobody got punished. Nobody got humiliated. Nobody got revenge. The person who needed to change eventually did. The people who didn't change learned that I was no longer going to make their choices easier by sacrificing my own boundaries. And my dad got to enjoy his retirement. A few months after the party, he called me one afternoon just to tell me he had finally used the money from the envelope. He had bought himself a new set of tools. He said he had stood in the store for almost an hour because he wasn't used to spending money on himself. I laughed. He laughed too. Then he told me he still had my letter. He said he had read it several times. I told him that was embarrassing. He said I should be embarrassed because the handwriting was terrible. That was probably the most normal conversation we'd had since everything happened. When we hung up, I thought about how close I had come to remembering that retirement party as the day my family tried to take my money. Instead, I think I'll remember it as the day I finally understood something I should have learned much earlier. Helping people is a choice. Being responsible is not consent. And loving your family does not mean handing them the keys to everything you worked for. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to keep rescuing someone. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for yourself is calmly let the facts speak for you. And sometimes the best response to someone deciding what your money should do is simply to keep your mouth shut, keep your records, sign nothing, and remember why you showed up in the first place. I went to my dad's retirement party to celebrate the man who spent 32 years working so his family could have a stable life. I left with a much clearer understanding of what that stability had actually cost all of us. And I still have the picture from that day. Dad is standing beside the cake, smiling. Mom is in the background talking to someone. Eric is holding a plate, and I'm standing near the gift table with an envelope in my hand. Nobody looking at that picture would know what was happening. Nobody would know that only minutes earlier I had been asked to sign away thousands of dollars. Nobody would know how many conversations and documents and arguments would follow. They would just see a family celebrating a retirement. For a long time, I thought that was the strange part. Now I think the strange part is how often the biggest family problems happen while everyone else is smiling for a photograph. And sometimes, the only thing that keeps you from becoming part of the problem is remembering that you are allowed to stop and ask one very simple question before signing anything. Who decided this was mine to give away?